is Kylie Duberstein, Extension Horse Specialist at the University of Georgia. We are finishing our 10-part video series on forage education for horse owners. So thank you all for tuning in for these videos. What we're going to do is we're going to wrap up with a video that I think a lot of people are going to be interested in, and that would be pasture management. We are standing on a piece of my property actually. My husband and I bought a piece of property about 2 years ago, and we have areas that look wonderful and we have areas that look like this. So you can see what I have here is an area with very little grass and a lot of weeds, and I'm sure this is a common theme that horse owners across the state, across the country struggle with. This isn't a pasture that's been overgrazed. We don't have very many horses on it. We just have poor fertility and poor grass growth. So what I want to do today is talk to you about how you can utilize your county extension office, your county extension agent, to help you solve some of these problems. So I'm going to tag team with my friend Lucy Ray, who is an extension agent in Morgan County, and we're going to ask her some questions about how to perform things like a soil test, how to apply fertilizer and lime, when to herbicide, and what herbicides to use. So again, we appreciate Lucy Ray being with us today, and we appreciate some of the insight that she might provide on managing this pasture and getting it in better shape. So thank you all again for tuning in for this last video in our education series. All right, we're here today with Lucy Ray. She is the County Extension Specialist in Morgan County, and we are so grateful to have your expertise on this video. And Lucy, it looks like we're standing in a pretty nice pasture, so I'm wondering if you can give us some tips on where we can get started to try to establish a nice stand of grass that you have here.
Absolutely, Dr. Duberstein, thank you very much. So the first thing to remember on any pasture situation or hayfield situation, or really anything that you're doing that involves soil, is that you want a soil test. One of our former specialists used to say that thou shalt soil test, and that's really the most important thing that you can do, because fertilizer is going to cost a lot of money, lime costs money, and soil tests and comparatively are very, very affordable, and that way you're not wasting your time and wasting your resources putting out something that your pasture really doesn't need. So what we're going to talk about a little bit today is soil testing in general and how to go about that. And you want to take an area about 15 acres and use that as one area to soil test. And what we've got here today is a couple of different ways that we can possibly have a soil probe, a couple of different ways that we can soil test. And in that 15-acre area that I was talking about, you really want anywhere from 15 to 20 core samples or spots to sample, and in a very randomized pattern. So in that pattern, you want to make sure that you're going down at least 4 inches deep and taking all of those cores, all of those soil samples, and putting them into one bucket or one container and mixing them all together. And then what that will do is give you a really representative sample of what you're looking for, and kind of an average, if you will, of what nutrients you're going to need in your pasture, all across your pasture or your hayfield. We do like to make sure that we tell folks to sample pastures about once every 3 years, so you can sample a third of your pastures each year, and follow those soil test recommendations. And hayfields or something like a garden spot, which is a lot higher producing, then you're really going to look at taking that every year, taking a soil sample for that every year, because you're asking the plants to do a lot more work, and you're expecting a lot more out of that soil. All right, so what we have is 2 different types of soil probes, and your local county agent, local county extension office is really where you're going to turn your soil sample in. And a lot of county extension offices have soil probes that they can rent out to folks as well. So this would be our step-on soil probe. You want to make sure you go down at least 4 inches deep into the ground. And then you can pull it out. Well, that didn't work well. At least 4 inches deep. and then deposit it in your bucket. And again, about 15 spots in a 15-acre field or so, or 15 spots no matter what the size of the field. And this is a little bit easier to handle. And this is a bit that fits just right on a regular drill. And you use it in your collect and go soil bucket. And drill it. And you can see that that actually throws the soil back into the bucket while you're drilling that.
Okay, so Lucy, that was really helpful showing us how to take a soil sample. I'm sure a lot of people are wondering what you might be able to do with that information once you get that and how that helps you make decisions when you go to manage your pasture. So you can talk about that just a little bit?
Absolutely. What you would do, you would end up with your soil sample, take it to your local county extension office, and they will send it off to the University of Georgia lab for analysis. And then what you will get back is basically a status report on the elements that are in your soil. So you can see here that we have the results both in a graph form and in a soil index form in a pounds per acre unit. And it basically shows where we sit as far as phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, zinc, manganese, and then probably one of our most important measures is pH. And then right below this graph, you can see that there is a part where it gives you your recommendations. There's the nitrogen recommendation is based on whatever crop that you would need, and what that crop would need, and then your phosphorus and potash or potassium recommendations. And on this particular example, what we're looking at is a fescue hayfield, this soil analysis. And you can see that our pH is at 6.4, which a pH above 6, anywhere from about 5.8 to 6.5 is really kind of what we need. All right, so a lot of our soils in Georgia are fairly acidic, and most of our beneficial forage species prefer a more neutral pH. So one of the things that we can do to make our conditions more favorable for those forage species is to use limestone, commonly called lime, to elevate that pH to a more neutral pH. And of course the exact pH is going to be dependent on which exact forage species you've got in your pasture or hayfield.
So Lucy, this is a lot of great information on why you would want to lime before you fertilize. So I think the most practical question that people are going to want to know is, when would you recommend liming and fertilizing? How do you time this? When do you do it together? Do you do it at different times? Can you give us some insight on that?
Absolutely. So one thing to remember is that it is important to soil test the same time every year, so you're comparing apples to apples, as it were. And you always want to make sure you apply lime first. Keep in mind that lime is going to take 3 to 6 months to change the pH of the soil, and you want that soil pH to be at a place where you can allow adequate utilization of fertilizer before you fertilize it. So you want to have enough time for that lime to work on a really acidic soil before you're applying your fertilization needs. You also want to consider what forage species you're trying to grow when applying your lime and your fertilizer. For example, if you're applying lime sometime in September or so for a fescue pasture, you would wait a couple of months before applying the fertilizer at the growth stage of that plant. That would be sometime in November or so. It doesn't make any sense to apply fertilizer to a Bermuda grass field, which is a warm season grass, in November when it's dormant. Instead, you want to apply fertilizer to a warm season forage sometime when it's greening up and entering the growth stage. So sometime in a Bermuda grass situation, you're looking at sometime in May and into June. Another thing to remember about applying lime and or fertilizer is that there are a lot of nutrients that are available in animal manure. So if you're in a situation where you have the opportunity to spread manure across your pastures, then the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that we see in commercial fertilizer is also available in animal manure. Another way that your county extension office is able to be of service is to actually run a test on your manure to find out the exact amounts of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in the manure, and you can kind of match that with what your soil needs. We get a lot of questions on whether or not it's a good idea to remove horses from pasture when we're fertilizing or liming, and it's a good practice to remove them until there's been a little bit of a rain or enough moisture to kind of let the soil absorb those nutrients.
All right, Lucy, can you give us a little bit of information on weed control? I know that's a big concern for a lot of horse owners that are trying to manage their pasture.
Absolutely. And one of the first things to really remember about weed control is what you've covered already in our rotational grazing systems. One of the lessons to remember is that nature hates a void. So if you're overgrazing a pasture to the point where those desirable species are not able to thrive and to grow, that is a perfect environment for weeds to come into. Okay, so this is a grazing stick, and I've got this one from the NRCS, or Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is an arm of the USDA. And basically this stick looks at different varieties of forage and their ideal heights for optimum production. So you can see here, this is actually our Bermuda grass side of the stick. And if you look down here at the bottom, anything under 2 inches would be a mandatory rest period. I tend to be a little more careful, and I really like a 3-inch rest period on Bermuda grass personally, but this is the textbook. So any forage under this for Bermuda grass needs to be rested. All right, so anything in the 2 to 6 inch range is going to be ideal forage for grazing. So that would be when you would turn your horses in to graze that Bermuda grass. Up here and above the 6 inch mark is when you would mow it for hay. Otherwise, it does not make logical sense to mow for hay a forage that is below 6 inches.
Cool. So Lucy, we looked at some great areas of your pasture where it looks fantastic, but now we're to an area that has weeds, and weeds are a common problem that horse owners face. I wonder if you could give us some insight on how we can control weeds. I know we can do a lot with rotational grazing and keeping grass height at the correct height to allow for a good stand of grass and a good defense. But I wonder if you could give us some insight on herbicides, and when you get weeds that are out of control, maybe how you might take care of those.
Absolutely. So weed control is probably one of the most important things. If I had to really assess our priorities, I would say our first priority is going to be to have the correct pH in our soil, so use our lime. And the second priority is going to be weed control. And just like our pH is going to have a beneficial effect on our grasses that we want to grow, surviving, typically our beneficial pH for our forage species are going to be detrimental to our weeds. As far as specific weed control in a pasture situation, we want to remember that we typically when you're looking at about 30 to 40% weed population in a pasture is when it's worth it, basically monetarily, to spray. We're really lucky. We do have a lot of options for weed control in Georgia, and there are different chemical classes that have been specifically developed and evaluated for specific weeds. So one of the most important things that you really want to keep in mind is, number one, to make sure that you've got the right weed. You can't just go buy generic weed killer and not know which weeds you're trying to control. We do have selective and non-selective herbicides. Selective would be herbicides that maybe kill a broadleaf weed in a grass pasture. Non-selective herbicides, an example of which would be glyphosate, commonly called Roundup, that basically acts on every surface that it touches. So we do have those options, but even every broadleaf weed killer is not necessarily going to kill every broadleaf weed. So I can't stress enough the importance of being able to identify the weeds that you have in your pasture. And again, that's where our county extension agents really come in as a help to us. So go and get that weed ID'd through your county extension office. and then they can help direct you to what weed is going to be most beneficial for your specific situation. So one thing to always remember as well is that the label is the law, so you do have to use each herbicide the way that it is labeled, and adhere to those regulations, otherwise you are in violation of federal law.
Lucy, can you tell us what time of year to spray?
You know, Dr. Dieberstein, that's a really good question, and that really depends on what kind of weeds that you have. A lot of times, by the time we actually notice a weed problem in our pasture, we're really past the ideal time to kill that weed. For example, these weeds here, this is coffee weed, also called sickle pod, and you can see that they have already developed their seed pods. So they have already matured out and are going through the reproductive stage, which means they are not going to be very easy to kill. If we were to apply an herbicide right now, you would see some dieback, but they've already developed seeds for next year's crop, so you're still going to have an issue next year. Really, the time to spray a weed is when it is very young and when it is actively growing. That's when it is the most susceptible to being damaged. So that's going to depend, again, on what kind of weeds you have. For example, these coffee weeds should have been sprayed about 3 months ago. And a lot of our winter annual weeds, for example, henbit, which is a purple flower that we see a lot in February, really needs to be sprayed in November before it starts flowering and going through that reproductive stage of its life. So one of the services that county extension offices offer is specific site visits to farmers and livestock producers of all kinds. So when I'm going to look at a horse pasture and make recommendations on weed control or pasture management, I always make sure that I do have my Georgia Pest Management Handbook with me. This handbook is actually updated every year with current recommendations according to current chemical labels and current herbicide labels. So I'm able to give on-site recommendations for the horse owner and for the landowner.
Oh, all right. Thank you so much, Lucy. This was a lot of great information on how to manage your pasture. I think this is a great way to finish up our series. Please make sure if you haven't checked out our other videos on forage education that you check some of those out. We have a lot of great resources in our county extension agents, and we are just so grateful for your expertise. So thanks so much for taking the time to do this today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for tuning into this video as well as to others in our series. We hope that this 10-part video education series has provided you with some helpful information about your horse's nutrition and forage management. The Cooperative Extension System at UGA has many resources that can assist you if you want further information or advice, so please don't hesitate to contact us. And also would like to say a special thank you to the Georgia Equine Commodity Commission for their funding of this educational video series. Again, thanks for watching.